Well, I think the United Nations is one of the most significant achievements of humanity, if you want, in modern times, and has made enormous achievements, especially in the areas of peace and security and sustainable development, bearing in mind that most of the crises we are facing today are trans-border, sometimes even continental crises. So we need a body like the United Nations to help us solve these issues. And it has enormous convening power. It brings the world together to, around shared goals. And then we do not always achieve those goals, but the goals focus collective attention on certain areas, and then we move forward towards them. So let's take in the area of biodiversity I work on. We used to have Aichi targets. We moved towards those targets. We then replaced them with the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and we're making progress towards those targets. So that is very important. But more than that, you see the UN very often act in the background, bring people together, create, the space to discuss complex issues that sometimes countries are not able to solve on their own. So we have a lot that the UN has been doing in the area of peace and security. We have 70 peacekeeping missions around the world. I think since the foundation of the EU, 11 or so are active now. We have disarmament treaties that were concluded with the UN acting as the convener and making them then UN brokering those treaties. So there's a lot that is happening in that space. And I think looking forward, no organization is perfect. I think there's a lot of discussion around UN reform, how we can deliver basically ever more effectively and efficiently. And that's an important conversation to have. And I think going forward, modernizing our operations and looking at the structures we have and how they deliver is very important.
You mentioned those peacekeeping missions. Of course, China has played a key role in those peacekeeping missions, as well as development, as well as global governance. How would you assess China's role at the UN?
Well, let me focus on the area I work in so that I can judge best. And there, I think China's contribution to global environmental governance, and particularly to the biodiversity agenda, has been remarkable. So China was the president of our COP15. So that was a remarkable multilateral process. So leading up to the conclusion or to the adoption of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which contains really unprecedented ambition and global commitment to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. And that was brokered by China as president of COP15. And then China went beyond that. You helped put this in place. But then China created the Kunming Biodiversity Fund, which is providing significant support to developing countries to implement the framework. China put in place an action initiative around the Global Biodiversity Framework, calling on countries to come in together and actually implement. But, all of that is one thing. What really matters most to me is, walking the talk, if you so want. And I think there as well, we can say that China is doing that. So China has updated its national biodiversity strategy and action plan and has adapted it to the 2030 ambition. But then, looking at China's domestic efforts, establishing a system of national parks, I think there are a lot of work around eco-red lines to minimize socioeconomic impacts of industrialization and of development on biodiversity. We're looking at regulations safeguarding ecosystem services. So there's a lot happening in China, and I think that's very encouraging.
Now, that Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, it sets out 23 goals or targets, including protecting 30% of land and sea by 2030. What can you tell us about how implementation of those goals are going so far?
Well, if I'm honest, it's a bit of a mixed picture. So many parties have already established at least one, often more than one national target to implement the global targets. There's a lot of focus on the target that you mentioned, the 30% target. It's a bit early days to really have a very clear sort of, view on where we are in implementation across the board. For this 30 by 30 target, we are not doing super well. around 10% of ocean areas that are being protected, just under 18%, I believe, of land areas. So there's a lot more that has to happen. And it's also important in that space that we don't just look at the figures, not just the percentages per se, but at the quality of the land that is being protected. So are these the most important and the most vulnerable ecosystems? Are they managed in a way equitably and with the participation of indigenous peoples and local communities? And then also very, very importantly, once an area is declared as being protected, is that protection actually effective, and is it backed up by real, let's say, enforcement and monitoring? But then, this is the one target everybody looks at. It's like a lighthouse target, and it's important. But we really have to understand that there are 23 action targets, and we need accelerated action on all of them. So next year, at our COP17 in Armenia, in Yerevan, in just about a year's time, we will do our first global review, and then we will have a clear picture where we are in terms of advancing towards the 2030 targets and where we have to pay particular attention and accelerate the most.